written copious books. I now used them when I was a student, but also continue to assign them to my own students. But there's one book in particular that was published in 2016 called Return to Cold War. And I think that is particularly apt. And I want to mention that in the context of the University Consortium, we talk a lot about how we got here, how we got to this point. We're focused on this security dilemma that Professor Istomin from McGill, our professor for this module, I think has mapped out extremely well over the last couple of days. And we also, of course, talk about the very real differences of interest that divide us. In our modules, we really do analyze the varying narratives and the different scholarly analyses in all of our regions about how we got here. And even if we don't always agree on all the points that each other makes, and I think this week Professor Istomin has highlighted some of the Russian narratives about this, but he's also, I think, mapped out in a very nuanced fashion some of the American narratives. And he also, interestingly, has engaged with some of the talk that we had yesterday about how did we get here. When Ambassador Nicholas Burns gave his explanation, and it allowed for Professor Istomin to engage with that. So we've had a really good time talking about this narrative. But one of the things is that we brought up yesterday, but didn't get a chance to answer, is where is here? You know, what does here mean? And that clearly, answering that question is clearly crucial. We need to diagnose where we are before we can prescribe any solutions to deal with it. And obviously there are many different answers to this question. You have the mainstream answer that says we are in a new or second Cold War. In fact, just this month, or I guess it was last month, you have a new report called Containing Russia by Philip Gordon and Robert Blackwell that talks about how we need to, their prescription is more sanctions, more cyber countermeasures, and permanent deployments of new military brigades across Central Europe. Robert Legvold has predicted these kinds of policy prescriptions that this kind of thing would emerge in his very thoughtful book that he wrote 2 years ago. And that critically analyzed the parallels between now and then. And he suggested that, I believe at the time, that, and I'm curious as to whether you still feel this way, that we were closer to the beginning of the old Cold War, that there were a lot of parallels there. Richard Sakwa wrote a piece not very long ago calling this a phony war, likening it to the time between 1939 and 1940, the time that came just before the real catastrophe of World War II. Still others just call this a protracted crisis or maybe normal great power competition. So Professor Legvold, I'm curious as to how your thinking about where we are has evolved since you wrote that book 2 years ago and as relations have continued steadily to deteriorate. And Professor Walt, you wrote recently about the importance of theory, international relations theory, for academic graduate programs in international relations, which would include regional area studies programs such as the ones in this consortium. You mentioned that none of the theoretical tools on their own is adequate to understand the big picture, and that we need to improve our analytical capacity for critical thinking. So my question to you would be, how can IR theory help us scholars improve our diagnosis of this situation that we're facing now between Russia, the US, and the EU, and what should we do about acquiring those skills, those tools? So I leave it to you all, and then we'll have time for group discussion at the end.
Okay, terrific. I just got the short straw, so I'm going to go first. So, you know, obviously there's an enormous amount of talk these days about this new Cold War, and you can understand why people are using that phrase to describe what's going on between Moscow and Washington. First of all, you see a lot of harsh rhetoric being exchanged by politicians on both sides from different circles. You see a lot of that in the media now. If you spend enough time on Twitter, you'll see lots of people hurling various bits of invective, and pundits of one type or another accusing one side or the other of being responsible. Secondly, there are clear worries whether they're valid or not, about possible Russian expansionism in Europe, its behavior in places like Syria. There's talk of a new arms race between the two countries, with Russian President Putin boasting of various dangerous new weapons, sounding a little bit like Nikita Khrushchev in doing so. And of course, the United States, for its part, is about to spend billions of dollars modernizing its own nuclear arsenal, by the way, regardless of what Moscow does. We were planning on doing that anyway. Russians fear American regime change and the gradual spread of liberal democracy eastward. Americans fear various nefarious Russian plots to disrupt and destabilize American democracy. So you put all those things together, you can understand why people see this as a sort of dangerous new turn in the always somewhat delicate relationship between these two countries. But I think to call this a new Cold War is in fact more misleading than enlightening. And such loose talk, or this sort of loose historical analogy, actually depends on us sort of completely forgetting what the old Cold War was really like. If you compare the two more carefully, I think it's clear what's happening today, even though it's not good, is a pale shadow of what happened, say, between 1945 or 47 and the breakup of the Soviet Union. Calling it a new Cold War, in fact, may lead us to misunderstand the basis for the current set of disagreements. And that's not good, because we actually really need to understand them. But more importantly, it may also cause us to miss a lot of what's really important and happening in world politics. People will begin to focus on the Cold War and think that's what the real action is in the international system, when in fact I would argue it's rather secondary to some far more important developments. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I think the Cold War really was, and then compare that with what we're experiencing today and try to convince you that they're really quite different things. First and foremost, the original Cold War was a bipolar competition in which the United States and the Soviet Union were far and away the two most powerful countries in the world. Right? And for realists, here comes the IR theory part, for realists like me, right, conflict between the two most powerful countries is almost inevitable. It's not due to misperception, it's not necessarily due to ideology, it's mostly due to the fact that each is the other's single greatest potential threat, and they will therefore keep a very wary eye upon each other. So you can imagine different Cold Wars that might have been hotter or colder, right, depending on policy decisions, but there was going to be suspicion and rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union, I think simply due to the structure of world politics. Second, during the Cold War, these two states had a rough parity. I would argue the United States was always considerably stronger, but never so strong that it could fully relax. U.S. economy was about 40% larger than the Soviet Union. The Soviet population was bigger. The U.S. military had greater global power projection capabilities, of superior Navy, superior Air Force, better technology, better training, but the Soviet Union had a larger army, and that army was poised close to areas that the United States regarded as vital interests. Our allies tended to be more loyal and capable than their allies were. We had Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, France, Israel. They had Bulgaria, South Yemen, Angola, Ethiopia. They had China as their junior partner at first, but then, of course, China, there was the Sino-Soviet split occurred, and China eventually tacitly sort of aligned with us. Egypt did much the same thing as well. So on balance, the United States was actually, I think, always in a better position throughout the Cold War, but never so much that it could relax completely. So it's bipolar, and there's rough parity between the two. Third, the Cold War was a competition between two incompatible universalist ideologies, liberal capitalism and Marxism-Leninism. Each of these ideologies saw itself as a model for the rest of the world. Americans believed that liberal capitalism ought to spread everywhere, and the Soviet Union thought Marxism-Leninism ought to spread everywhere. Each saw the existence of the other, regardless of what it was doing, just by existing, was to some degree a threat to the other's basic ideological position. And then finally, as my colleague Arne Wested shown clearly in his book, The Global Cold War, the real Cold War was a global competition that was waged on essentially every continent in the world in one form or another. In fact, you could argue that the Cold War shaped much of the agenda of world politics, not all of it, but a great deal of it, and had very far-reaching effects in Europe, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia as well. There were really hardly any global issues of significance that were unaffected by it. That was the old Cold War. So what's happening today? Well, I think the situation we're facing today is really radically different. I mean, first of all, the world is not bipolar. It's either unipolar still, if you think that, or it might be multipolar, a sort of lopsided multipolarity. And if it eventually turns into a bipolar world again, it's not going to be Moscow and Washington, it's going to be Washington and Beijing. Right? So if it's bipolar, it's not with Russia. Second, there's no parity here. The United States has an economy of about $17 trillion. Russia is less than $2 trillion now. The United States has a comparatively young population, and that population is still increasing. Russia's population is aging and shrinking. The United States remains technologically sophisticated, highly innovative. Nobody, I think, is sitting at home waiting to buy the next Russian smartphone. Its economy depends heavily on energy exports. Their value is likely to decline over time as well. It still has cutting-edge military technologies, and that's a principal export. But I would argue that most of its designs lag behind those of the United States as well. In fact, when you think about it, we have almost a complete reversal of the Cold War roles of Russia and China. China is now the main U.S. competitor and certainly likely to be in the decades ahead. Russia has become China's junior partner, turning around the relationship that existed in the 1950s. Third difference, there's no serious ideological rivalry here. Putin claims to represent sort of traditional Russian values, maybe orthodoxy, but I don't think there's really a Russian model of governance or ideological blueprint available for export. Donald Trump is probably the only person in America who thinks strongman rule is the wave of the future, but he won't be president for life no matter how much he might want to be. So I don't think there's an ideological conflict of any real sort here. And finally, I said the first Cold War was a global competition. Today, the rivalry between the United States and Russia is limited to areas rather close to Russia's borders, like Ukraine or the Middle East, but not really anywhere else. And I would argue that Russia's role in these places has been predominantly negative and defensive. For example, they may be able to keep Ukraine from drifting into the orbit of the West. They may be able to keep Bashar al-Assad in power in Syria, but Russia has yet to demonstrate a capacity to achieve sort of more positive purposes, to bring a whole series of nations together to achieve a common goal. And finally, for all of the talk about new weapons, new nuclear weapons, again, it's hard for me to see that as an existential rivalry, and it's hard for me to believe that we're going to see an arms buildup similar to the one that happened in the old Cold War, where, remember, the United States and old Soviet Union each had in excess of 40,000 nuclear weapons apiece. I don't see anything like that occurring anytime soon. So to sum this all up, those who speak now of a new Cold War are, I think, being sort of intellectually lazy. It's applying a familiar label that we all recognize to a phenomenon that's actually quite different. It's about as useful as comparing the situation in the Middle East today to the 30 Years' War. There are some superficial similarities, but what's going on is mostly rather different. And I think this is a problem for a couple of different reasons. First, calling it a new Cold War, again, makes it sound like the old days when the rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union was structurally determined. It was a function of bipolarity. And it really wasn't, in my view anyway, because people were making mistakes, misunderstanding each other, or things like that. Today, the frictions between Russia and the United States aren't due to the balance of power, but due, in my view, to errors, hubris, blunders, misunderstanding, and chronic failures of diplomacy. And the more we rely on a model, sort of the new Cold War, the more we miss the fact that there's a lot of human agency involved here, and therefore there are things that we and they could do to try and alleviate this. So that's one big problem. Second, calling this a new Cold War and suggesting that this is really what's driving world politics today, I think distracts us from the far more serious challenge that China is going to pose. China has the potential to be a more serious competitor, I think, than the old Soviet Union was. It's relying on markets rather than central planning. It has rapidly improving technology. It has a lot more people. It's grown quite rapidly for nearly 4 decades. Even worse, talking about a new Cold War with Moscow does the one thing the United States shouldn't be doing at the moment, namely pushing China and Russia closer together. Instead of pushing them closer, we should actually be doing everything we can to try and drive them apart. I think their history, their geographic proximity means that these two countries are not, in fact, natural allies, but they have found it useful and, from my perspective, completely understandable to cooperate to keep the powerful and, in many ways, highly revisionist United States from operating with complete freedom and complete abandon. So going forward, the United States should be looking for ways to resolve our differences with Moscow and take advantage of the divisive tendencies in the current Sino-Russian security partnership. And talking a lot about a new Cold War interferes with that goal, which is yet another reason not to use that particular phrase to describe what is admittedly a difficult and tense relationship between Moscow and Washington today. I'll stop there.
I start by saying that I'm a great fan of Steve's, and he knows that. We served on a board together, and before that board I said I thought the blog that Julie referred to that's on foreign policy is the single best essay that you can find in this business.
I fear this is all just setting me up for something.
The phrase in Russian is "однако." Steve, in a way, that's true. As I am praising Steve because I'm going to disagree with him. That won't surprise you, since Julie told you the title of this book 2 years ago was "Return to Cold War." But I'd also say that, Steve, last fall I was asked in the context of the centenary of the Bolshevik Revolution in 17 to contribute to a historians' conference in Moscow. And what I chose to do was look at the impact that the French Revolution had on the international relations of the century that followed with the Bolshevik Revolution and the impact that it had on the century that followed. And my key point of departure was a book that Walt wrote when he was a young man called Revolution and War, in which he compared the impact of the French and the Russian, but also the Iranian, the Mexican, the Chinese revolution on this problem of war. As I say, it was the spine of what I had to say in that paper. But I do disagree with his dismissal of the notion of Cold War as a way of trying to capture what's happened in the U.S.-Russia relationship. I want to explain to you what my stake is in that concept. It's not a kind of intellectual gymnastics, and I hope it's not intellectual laziness, as Steve put it, clinging to or grasping a label that's easy when things go really wrong. We do it in many contexts. We do it in personal relations. We do it in corporate relationships when things are really sour, but people aren't killing one another yet. We will describe that as a Cold War. And it was when things went badly in the U.S.-Russia relationship in 2014 in the context of the Ukrainian crisis, it was very easy for people to say it's a Cold War. There had been some, by the way, who had been arguing we were in a Cold War with Russia from the beginning of the Putin regime. Ed Lucas from The Economist wrote a book in 2007 arguing it was a new Cold War because of the nature of the Putin regime. And he had another colleague in the world of journalism, Mark McKinnon, who had a book titled the same thing, The New Cold War. That was 2007. And it was shortly after Putin gave the speech in the Munich Security Conference in February 2007. I thought that misunderstood either the problem in U.S.-Russia relations at that point or misunderstood the concept of Cold War itself. So when things went really in the wrong direction in the context of the Ukrainian crisis in 2014, my sense was that we'd gone over the cliff in the relationship. It was now fundamentally, that is qualitatively different from what it had been for much of the post-Cold War period, the Yeltsin period and the first part of Putin in power. And one needed to find a way to capture that qualitative difference. I would say parenthetically to anyone in this room and to Steve, if it's not a new Cold War, then how do you capture what I think you would agree is qualitatively different? It's now an adversarial relationship. Before it was one where we weren't quite certain whether we were friend or foe. We hoped mostly friend. It was what I called a useful ambiguity in the relationship until 2014 in the Ukrainian crisis. We went over the cliff, as I said, in 2014. So how do you capture that if it's not Cold War? Julie mentioned two things. Sakwa's notion that it's phony war. I don't understand that in this context. And the other one was, I forget the phrase that someone was using in terms of capturing some aspect of geopolitics that was at work.
Just normal great power competition.
Well, yeah, no, that's familiar. And in a way, that's where Steve has been for some time, where Walter Russell Mead has been. It's where John Mersheimer has been. That is, John's phrase is, it's geopolitics 101. And people shouldn't be surprised that it happened in this context. My stake in the term begins with the notion that I want to find some way to capture the depth of the hole that we're in U.S.-Russia relations. Something does justice to that qualitative change. Something that does justice to the consequences of having gone over the cliff and being someplace that's quite different from where we were 6 years ago, 10 years ago, along the line. Now, for me, Cold War does that, and here I'm not being intellectually lazy. I've spent a lot of time thinking about why Cold War does and doesn't work as a concept in this context. It doesn't work for the reasons that Steve gave, and this is what people produce constantly when they're arguing against the notion of Cold War. It does not encompass the entire international system. The international system is not suffused with the Cold War, the dynamic of the Cold War as it was in what was an international system of bipolarity, as he said. Others will normally argue that it doesn't unfold as the other one did under the shadow of nuclear Armageddon. And it isn't, as Steve was saying, driven by some deep ideological animus or competing political economic models, if you will, along the line. And you can add other things. He adds the discrepancy of power, which is much greater than it was in that earlier period. All of that's true. When the book was done, the publishers wanted to call it, rather casually, Return to the Cold War. I said, no, take the article out. It's not a return to the Cold War. It's fundamentally different. But it does, as Julie alluded, she asked me whether I'm still there, it does parallel the original Cold War in 5 critical respects. And those respects were truest in the period from the Berlin crisis in 1948 till sometime after Stalin's death in 1953. What are they? The first is that each country blames the other almost 100% for where we are, problem. And they blame them not each other in that fashion, not merely because of what the other country is doing. They do it because of the essence of the other system, the nature of the other system, the nature of the other God. Secondly, the assumption is that the problem in the relationship on both sides, each makes this assumption, is not simply a conflict of interests, it's a conflict of purpose. It's a fundamentally, we're at odds in terms of what we want to see happen in the outside world, and we ascribe that to the other side. Third, as a consequence, the assumption is that this will not change in any basic way. There aren't opportunities to turn this relationship around, despite Steve's argument that it's essentially a matter of agency and national leaders that have performed badly in this context, until there is fundamental change in the other side. Either fundamental change in the nature of the other side or at a minimum fundamental change in the thrust of its foreign policy. Fourth, The assumption then, in that earlier period, that changed in the course of the Cold War, but in those early years was that the only kind of business that we can do is transactional. Yes, maybe we'll have a deal on Iran and their nuclear program. Maybe we could get a deal on chemical weapons in Syria, but we cannot have a process where cooperation is cumulative and we can move forward. That was true in the original Cold War through the initial Geneva summits and probably until we got to the Test Ban Treaty, or until '69 when we agreed to begin negotiating SALT. And then fifth and finally, the dynamic in the areas of conflict metastasized. The synergy in the relationship is all negative. One thing that happens that's bad washes over and influences what's happening in other areas of the relationship. There's literally no positive synergy in the relationship at this point. That was also true in the original Cold War. Therefore, from my point of view, these 5 characteristics give me some sense of how deep the hole is. And why is that important? Because that then gives you some sense of how difficult it's going to be to dig out of it. Back to this notion of if agency were a little better, if leaders were a little more skilled, we could soon begin turning this around. I don't think so. I don't think so at all easily. And that leads then to a further thing. Well, then what are the costs that we're paying for this in this context? A U.S.-Russia relationship that is in this deep a hole with obstacles that are this great for digging out of it. Before going on to talk about what the costs are, I'd make a point generally about the analytical frameworks that we're working with in both countries. And when I say analytical frameworks, I mean broadly. Media, our politicians, our expert community, whether they're think tanks or whether it's in the university world. And what marks both Moscow and Russia generally, and on the U.S. side, across this spectrum, what I'm calling the analytical spectrum, is that the refinements across that spectrum are weak or largely missing, and essentially we've got 2 ends of the spectrum, there and history and here. And one end of that spectrum, by and large the most negative part of that spectrum, is dominant in both countries in the circumstances. So let me explain what I have in mind before I get to the ultimate point. Understand how deep the hole is, how difficult it's going to be to dig out of it, and what are the costs of being where we are. It is the first contrast, if you think about the 2 extremes of the poles. And there's a bit of it in what Steve is, the way in which he's making the presentation. The question is, does Russia matter? And the opposite end of that spectrum is, by and large, Russia doesn't matter at this stage. Those who say that it doesn't matter are by far dominant. Just in the same way that there are many in Moscow that would like to make the argument that the United States no longer matters for a separate set of reasons that I'm not going to, we can talk about that when we begin to change ideas. It's typified by, say, David Brooks in something that he wrote now 2 years ago. How did he characterize Russia and Putin? His phrase was, the single phrase was, Putin is a thug sitting atop a failing regime. Yesterday, Tony Blinken had a piece in the New York Times, in his column, in which he talks about Russia and Putin as Vladimir Potemkin, that Russia is essentially a Potemkin village. You've got this aggressive, exaggerated language, bluster, performance, such as you had in the so-called State of the Union address to the Federation Council last week, with the videos and the nuclear weapons and the like of it. But behind it is a country in decline, a country that's failing demographically, failing economically. That's even before you start with the notion that it already is, as Steve has pointed out, materially vastly inferior, militarily, economically, in terms of technology and so on, to the United States. The reaction at this end of the spectrum, Russia really doesn't matter, given those facts, is it's one of 2 things. For some, as a result, the state of the relationship, the fact that it's in the hole that I'm describing, doesn't really matter. It's not all that important. It's unfortunate, but it's not critical to either U.S. foreign policy or to international politics generally. Russia is, in short, too weak to justify the overreaction that it's getting from us on all issues, even probably the issue of interference in our elections and the attack on democratic institutions, the way in which it gets framed. For others in this camp, that Russia doesn't matter, it is that Russia's weakness, which, as I say, Tony Blinken stressed, Vladimir Potemkin, that Russia's weakness is a source of trouble, because in this context the risk is that Putin and the Russian leadership will lash out, or they'll engage in the kinds of things they did in the U.S. election, or what they tried to do in Europe and elsewhere. And that's a problem for us. We're going to have to deal with it. How do we deal with it? We deal with it with a very harsh, hardline policy. Reinforce sanctions. Do sanctions and then do them again. And then do them again. Or now begin to deal with Russia as a military threat in the nuclear area that we say it is. Steve, one of his recent pieces has been on the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review. But Steve, if you go back and compare the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review with the framing context for the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, you see how fundamentally different national leadership in the United States is framing the Russia problem. In the past, it was in 2010, Russia is a potential partner in dealing with fundamental issues. We can work with them in enhancing strategic stability. Why? And the phrase in the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review is because we're no longer adversaries. In this one, it starts by saying the nature of international politics has changed fundamentally since that posture review. Geopolitical struggle and threats are back, and Russia and China are named specifically. And then it lists the reasons why we're worried about Russia and China in that context. So the response, as I've said, is hard line. And it is what Steve fears will be the consequence, and I think it's a justified fear that if you call it a Cold War, you'll begin reacting the way we did in the harshest moments of the original Cold War. The truth of the matter is, ironically, paradoxically, is leadership, Putin does this regularly, denies it's a new Cold War. Their former ambassador, Kislyak, continually denied we were in a new Cold War. And the same thing is true of a number of people in Washington, and yet you're getting exactly what you feared, Steve. You're getting exactly what you feared. That this is now a militarized adversarial relationship, and it'll be increasingly so. And it will affect nuclear weapons. Wait until you see the missile defense report that'll come out within another week or so. I'm willing to bet that it won't only be about North Korea and Alaska. It will be about European phased adaptive approach and beginning to turn that in a way that deals with Russia. And the same thing will happen in Asia in terms of China. There will be people who argue, no, in the end, we're the ones that don't need INF, the INF agreement, because we need to begin deploying ground-launched cruise missiles in the Asian theater in order to deal with the China threat. That's the China component of it. Now, the other side of it, those who argue that Russia matters, and that's a much weaker voice, it's the other end of the spectrum. You have colleagues over at the Kennedy School who run a program called Russia Matters in order to try to stress the way it's important. I'm in that camp, that Russia matters. And why? Where do I start? It's the problem I have with the schools in my discipline, which are, it's political science, international relations. It's where Steve is one of the most prominent spokesmen for realism, with the emphasis on materialism, the emphasis on power, and the distribution of power. He's not quite with a structural realist, but he certainly believes in the geopolitical effects of power and its distribution. I would argue there's another concept that one might use, which is simply the significance of a country, quite apart from the precise quotients of power. And for Russia, it starts with not the political scientist label, but with the real estate agent's label. Location, location, location. Steve made the point that Russia does matter in the troubles around the world, but it's the areas immediately around Russia, and it's therefore, unlike the original Cold War, not a global struggle. Russia doesn't matter in Africa in the way it did originally. It doesn't matter in Central America or with Cuba in the way in which it did originally. But if you think about those areas around Russia, the concentric circles around Russia that matter, from North Korea to the northern tier, to India, Pakistan, to the Caucasus, up to Eastern Europe, I can't think of parts of the world that matter more. And I don't know any country that matters more in those contexts than Russia. Just look at your daily headlines in the newspapers. Why is that? Because Russia has relevant power, and beyond the relevant power, other things that make it significant to what's going to happen in Ukraine, what's going to happen today in Syria, because it is beginning to edge out back into the global reach that it didn't have during a period of great weakness in the 1990s, and so on. But then it matters in specific contexts. It matters in the nuclear context. And here, I don't think Steve would disagree with me. Julie referred to this project that I'm co-chairing with Chris Chiba from Princeton on meeting the challenges of the new multipolar nuclear world. I can tell you there's a lot to worry about what's happening among the 9 nuclear powers, particularly the 5 principal nuclear powers, the US, Russia, China, plus India and Pakistan at this point. And if there's going to be any kind of leadership, we're going in the other direction now, we're dismantling arms control. If there's going to be any kind of leadership, it'll have to be from the 2 countries that still have 92% of the weapons, Russia and the United States. And instead, we're not going beyond New START. We're in the process probably of abandoning INF. And even if we renew New START in 2021, I think that's the end of arms control between the United States and Russia. In a world, I don't have time to go into what I see as the dangers of this world, that's very significant. Secondly, Russia is significant in league with the problem that Steve raised, which is Russia in league with Russia. Now, Steve's strategy would be for us to try to split the two apart. The last thing that Zbig Brzezinski wrote, an op-ed in the New York Times, with another colleague of his, was wise, and it probably will surprise you in terms of whatever memory you have of Zbig on the issue of the Soviet Union and China. Zbig made the argument with his partner that if there's going to be global stability in the 21st century, it is going to require cooperation among the 3 most militarily powerful countries. That was his phrase. Among the 3 most militarily powerful countries, the United States, Russia, and China. I agree with Steve that the fundamental issue is that we not reach a tipping point that turns to genuine and full-scale strategic rivalry with China. He's absolutely right to put the accent on U.S.-China relations. But Russia is very important to how that story turns out as well. And as I said, for the reasons that's big, that Brzezinski gave in the New York Times op-ed piece. I'll finish by saying what I started with. What are the stakes? I think there are many, but I would identify 4. One I just alluded to. If we're going to get some handle, as opposed to what we're doing right now, losing control over trends in a very different, very complex, and potentially dangerous as peak moments of crisis in the Cold War world, that is this new emerging multipolar nuclear world, we need U.S.-Russia cooperation rather than the rivalry that we've got now. Secondly, if you think about whatever is the long-run potential for European security and the hopes that we had for an all-European security community or cooperative framework coming out of the Cold War, that's all now fantasy. But were we to have it, and that now includes Arctic, if we're going to have it, that requires U.S.-Russia, Russia-West cooperation. And again, obviously in this context, we're spinning in the opposite direction. Third, the point I was just making use of Brzezinski. If there's going to be a single critical set of relationships, the core of which will be the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, but in the end, the way in which that works out will be very heavily the triangular relationship with Russia on any of the issues that we want to talk about parenthetically, whether it's nuclear or whether it's climate change or whether even in many ways it's energy. You're going to need not just U.S.-China cooperation or even bilateral U.S.-Russia cooperation. You're going to need U.S. Russian-Chinese trilateral cooperation. And part of the problem, again parenthetically, in both U.S. and Russian and Chinese foreign policy right now is all governments, all leaderships are thinking in bilateral terms. They're not thinking in trilateral terms. Instead, they're allowing themselves to flow with the currents. Finally, the question of opportunity cost is in terms of what kind of a crucible of trouble the Eurasian core is going to be in the long run. I'd be willing to argue that beyond the war within the Islamic world, the internal war in the Islamic world, which begins in the Middle East but extends beyond that, if you look 10, 20 years out, I suspect the single geographical location of the most potential trouble in international politics will come from within and connected to the next concentric circle in the Eurasian core. It already is, in terms of troubles that we've had that haven't spilled out in a global way in Caucasus, in Central Asia, but we haven't yet begun to see what the impact on international politics will be in the long run of further change within Central Asia. We already see what's happening in the European context around the Ukrainian crisis, but that's not the end of the story. We know of the instability that we've had in the Caucasus around Georgia, what remains in that area. There's also the long-run question of what will happen around Belarus. It's what I call the new lands in between, for those of you who think of the historical reference to Central Europe in the 19th and the interwar period in the 20th century. The new lands in between are those that are in between the Russian core and its alliances and NATO and Western Europe, where the alternative security system has been built. What I'm going to stop now because I'm using too much time. What I would have done next is the next juxtaposition at the two ends of the spectrum of the Russia matters, doesn't matter, are the explanations for Russian behavior. And without going through it, we can go back and talk about it. I think there are two kinds of explanations, again with one that dominates. The one that dominates is that Russia, Putin, that regime is driven by an idea or is driven by a system, the system as it is. For example, it's often argued, certainly popular in the US Congress, that Russia is what it is for systemic reasons, does what it does for systemic reasons. It needs an external enemy in order to maintain power, and hence the anti-Americanism, the elections, and the rest. Can't afford to have democracy moving toward its borders because it's contagious, hence Ukraine. And indeed, the reason why Russia is, as Chuck Todd said on Meet the Press on Sunday morning, the disruptor, the major disruptor in international politics, attempting to sabotage democracy wherever it exists in Europe and elsewhere. And third, it is what it is because its legitimacy, when it fails around economic success, then turns to a kind of crude nationalism, Krim nash, hence Crimea, what was done in Crimea, and so on. That becomes the explanation for why they do what they do, or a structural explanation. It's there from the realist side for geopolitics. Is what else did you expect when you have a weakened Russia that is dealing with an overweening West, including the United States? It's Mersheimer's argument when he's talked about the mistake, the West being responsible for the hole that we're in, and most particularly because of NATO enlargement. Or the alternative sort of structural explanation is it's in Russia's historical genes. It's the nature of the political system and the authoritarianism. Or it's in the historical problem of Russia in the West, including Martin Madian and the arguments that have been made for a long time about Russia in the West. The alternative explanation at the other end of the spectrum, and frankly it's where I am, although there's no way of proving things one way or the other, there'll be some tests, that Russian behavior, including the Putin regime's behavior, is event-driven, and that it is tactical and pragmatic far more than one that's in pursuit of a strategic vision. That would need some explanation, and my time is up for going about that. But it becomes a critical juxtaposition to the University Consortium, those of you that are studying in this area on both sides. Do you want to pursue this question of does Russia matter or not? On what grounds? What criteria? And the other is, if you're explaining why Russia does what it does, you also need then the comparable why the United States does what it does or why the Europeans do what they do within this context. But on the Russian side, do you believe it is systemic or structural, or do you believe that it is event-driven? That's a discussion or an issue that is not, we haven't even begun to engage. We're not even in a position to engage it. I think we haven't begun it in the expert community. We should be able to do it there, but we haven't done it nationally in media and among our politicians, not the least because, as I say, there's nothing that's vibrant across the spectrum. It's at the two ends of the spectrum, and the one side, the one end of the spectrum is very weak, almost unheard, and the noise is coming from the dominant point in that spectrum. So we haven't, I think, begun wrestling with the questions we need to wrestle with.
Thank you. I was thinking, while you were talking, it'd be so interesting to allow you all to respond to each other as well, and also to take some questions.
I'll really brief. So actually, if you were really paying close attention, we don't disagree that much.
That's right.
Despite Bob's attempt to portray us as poles apart, we're not disagreeing about what the state of the relationship is right now, and we're not disagreeing about that it's bad. I think we agree on all of that. We're disagreeing to some degree on what to call it. And one of the reasons that I don't like the phrase New Cold War is that if you want cooperation, if you want to try and improve the relationship, calling it a Cold War evokes a set of historical memories, a set of associations, that set of structural explanations that immediately makes people say, well, if it's the Cold War again, we're just going to have to do what we did in the last Cold War. What did we do? We did the full court press and we waited them out and we eventually brought them down. Right, if you want to get cooperation, you don't want to use phrases like Cold War. You want to emphasize where you came up with it at the very end, that this is event-driven. This isn't necessarily structural. This has been an unfortunate series of responses on both sides, where I would believe most of the blame is in fact on our side. Because basically what's happened over the last 25 years, the United States has been the principal revisionist power in the world for the past 25 years. It was our openly declared policy that we were going to spread democracy, markets, and global institutions that we designed and led just about everywhere we could. We were going to do that peacefully if we could, but if necessary, Libya, Iraq, elsewhere, we do it by using force or economic sanctions or some combination of the two. We kept insisting that we had the right to do all of these things, and if anybody objected, they were in the wrong. Now, if any other country had adopted that policy towards us, and especially if they had adopted that policy in the Western Hemisphere, we would have gone absolutely bananas, right? So I view this as very much event-driven, not entirely, but mostly our doing, and therefore calling it a Cold War just, I think, it lets those responsible off too easy. And one final point, why I don't like Cold War. How many Cold Wars are we in now? We're in a Cold War with Russia, if you use that label. We're in a Cold War with North Korea, if you mean an intense competition that isn't open warfare. We're in a Cold War with Iran. We've been in that one for 30 or 40 years. Right? How many Cold Wars are we in? So I guess I like the label sort of, we have a great power competition going on here, one that's in a particularly bad place right now, but one that is not inevitable and could in fact be improved over time with more intelligent policies. Let me stop there because I'm sure that others...
Let me respond to that and then say something larger, because in many ways, if there was to be a real debate over whether this is a Cold War or not, Steve and I are the wrong two people to have that, for a reason I'll come to in a moment. On this question of the costs of calling it a Cold War and the way in which it jeopardizes the prospects for cooperation, Steve's absolutely right. The reason why that book on Return to Cold War was done wasn't my idea. It was a publisher that came to me having seen a piece I did in Foreign Affairs called Managing the New Cold War. I drafted that in April of 2014 as the Donbass War was beginning. And at that point, I sensed that, as I said at the outset, we'd gone over the cliff. We were going over the cliff. We were moving into a period that was qualitatively different, and it was going to be very difficult to get ourselves back to a point where we hope we'd make some progress. The history from 1991 until roughly fall of 2013 in the U.S.-Russia relationship had been one of ups and downs. High hopes that were then trampled or that were lost, and then we would get back to it again. High hopes until NATO enlargement, then slowly we began rebuilding after that. Then we got Kosovo in 1999, collapse again. Then we began rebuilding again, slowly and particularly after 9/11. And then we got the Iraq War and we were down again. And then we got Munich speech and we got George and so on. So it was up and down. But there was always the hope that somehow we could begin putting this on a basis where we could get traction. The analytical problem during that period was explaining why we couldn't get traction over that period of time, why we had the ups and downs. But in 2014, I sensed that was over. We weren't going to get back to a period where we could move forward. We were at a different place at that point. And I wrote that piece, and then I was asked to do the book. People with whom I normally agree and whom I highly respect that are in the same field, looking at Russia and looking at U.S.-Russia relations, people like Tom Graham, Jim Collins, our ambassador, really disagreed, said don't call it a Cold War. And they said don't call it a Cold War for exactly the reasons that Steve just gave you. People will think in Cold War terms, and it will encourage, not merely will it block cooperation, but it will lead us to strategies that we followed during the Cold War that will be counterproductive. So that's absolutely correct. My response was, but you're not going to begin dealing with it until, the English for the Russian phrase, until you begin calling things by their names, until you know where you are in the relationship. Anything else that has the risk of sugarcoating it is going to allow you, A, to say it's affordable. And I, at another meeting that Julie was at in Moscow, I said where we are right now is that national leaders on all sides, European, Russian, and the United States, see this as affordable wreckage. Affordable wreckage. That's where we are. And I think that's because we're not recognizing how bad things are. So to Steve, my first response, and then the second point I'd make, my first response is, I think it's important to understand how bad it is so that we can understand what the costs are. So it's not simply a matter of saying, well, it's geopolitics we're familiar with, only in this relationship it's bad. And we've got some other bad relationships that look like this with Iran, with North Korea, and so on. But when you then get to the cost of it being this bad with Russia, even though you've got these power discrepancies, then the costs, I come back to the opportunity costs, nuclear, European security, Eurasia, crucible of trouble in the future, and dealing with the rise of new great powers, China, Iran's not going to help us in dealing with any of those problems other than from the fringes, the nuclear issue. North Korea may create the nuclear crisis, but it's not going to be key to dealing with any of those opportunities. Now, one of the reasons why Steve and I are wrong on this, those of you who follow Steve's work know that he, as much as, because Julie doesn't disagree with much what I'm arguing, what Julie and I would argue in this context, we're shouting into a very powerful headwind that is completely eclipsing those voices at the end of the spectrum. But Steve is doing it at another level. Steve and Barry Posen and John Mearsheimer are arguing that the U.S. now in this context should be practicing a policy of restraint. He and John have done this piece where he's arguing for offshore balancing rather the kind of intrusive foreign policy strategy that we've followed. I think he would probably agree with Barry's piece in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, arguing that America first in Trump hands is not what people think it is. It is what he calls illiberal hegemony. I suspect Steve agrees with that in the present context. But Steve and Barry and John, I happen to agree with them. But it's just a second way in which I, and the primary way in which he's shouting into a very, very powerful headwind. And the implications of making that kind of an argument is we ought to be pursuing a different kind of policy toward Russia. That's what brings Steve and I back together again.
Do we want to take some? I'm gonna do what we do at Oxford, and we tend to take students first. Although